the story of the most profound mind of the modern age does not begin with complex equations or grand lectures, but in the soft, amber-lit rooms of a modest house in Ulm, Germany, in the late 19th century. Imagine a world of heavy wooden furniture, the scent of lavender and old paper, and the rhythmic, comforting sound of a ticking pendulum clock. Albert was a quiet child, a boy of deep silences and wandering eyes. While other children filled the air with loud games and restless energy, Albert moved through the world like a slow-moving river, observing the way the sunlight hit the dust motes in the air, or the pattern of the frost as it crept across the window pane in the heart of winter. His parents, Hermann and Pauline, watched him with a mixture of love and gentle concern, for the boy did not speak until he was nearly 4 years old. He lived in a world of pure observation, a world where the primary language was not words, but the silent, logical beauty of shapes and light, the pivotal moment of his early childhood, a moment that would set the rhythm for his entire life, occurred when he was 5 years old and, lying in bed, recovering from a small illness, his father brought him a simple gift, a small, pocket-sized magnetic compass. Imagine the young boy's hands, pale and still, holding the cold brass casing of the instrument. As he tilted the compass this way and that, he noticed something that felt like a miracle. No matter which way he turned the metal box, the needle swung back with a quiet, determined precision, always pointing north. It was as if an invisible hand were reaching through the very fabric of the room, pulling the needle toward a secret destination. This was not a toy. It was a revelation. In the absolute stillness of his bedroom, Albert felt a shiver of wonder. He realized that beneath the surface of the world we see, there are hidden forces, silent, invisible, and perfectly ordered, that govern everything, from the smallest needle to the largest star. This sense of something deeply hidden became the heartbeat of his childhood. Imagine him sitting for hours in the family garden, his back against an ancient oak tree, watching the clouds drift across a pale blue sky. He wasn't just looking at the clouds. He was feeling the immense, invisible pressure of the atmosphere and the steady pull of the earth beneath him. The world was a grand, silent puzzle, and Albert was content to spend his days in quiet contemplation of its pieces. His mind worked slowly, deliberately, like a master craftsman at a workbench. He preferred the company of his own thoughts to the noise of the schoolyard. To him, the silence was not empty. It was full of possibilities. It was in these quiet hours that he began to develop the extraordinary ability to visualize the impossible. He would close his eyes and imagine what it would be like to race alongside a beam of light, or how the space between two objects might bend and stretch like a silken fabric. The house in Munich, where the family moved shortly after his birth, was a place of intellectual warmth. His father's workshop, filled with the hum of early electrical dynamos and the smell of ozone and copper wire, provided a rhythmic backdrop to his growing curiosity. Albert would wander among the machines, fascinated by the invisible power of electricity that could light a room or turn a wheel. He saw the harmony between the music his mother played on the piano, the structured, mathematical beauty of Mozart and Beethoven, and the mechanical wonders of his father's trade. The world was a symphony of hidden rhythms, and even as a young boy, Albert was learning to hear the music. As the moon rose over the Bavarian rooftops, casting long silvery shadows across his bed, the boy would sleep with the compass resting on the nightstand. The needle remained steady, pointing true, a silent reminder that the universe was a place of order, mystery, and infinite peace. Every breath he took was a step into the unknown, guided by a curiosity that was as constant as the North Star. As Albert grew older, the quiet sanctuary of his nursery expanded into a world of humming machines and the smell of ozone. His father, Hermann, and his uncle Jakob ran an electrochemical factory in Munich, a place that felt like a laboratory of wonders to a young, observant boy. Imagine walking into this workshop in the late 1880s. The air is thick with the scent of hot copper, lubricating oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of electricity. For Albert, this wasn't just a place of business. It was a cathedral of logic. The sound of the workshop was a constant, low-frequency vibration, a rhythmic thrumming of dynamos, and the steady clicking of brass switches. It was a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to echo the very pulse of the universe. Albert would spend hours sitting on a wooden stool in a quiet corner, his eyes fixed on the spinning wheels and the intricate web of wires that crisscrossed the ceiling. He watched how the invisible current could spark across a gap, a tiny bolt of lightning tamed by human hands, and he wondered about the silent power that moved through the metal as if it were water flowing through a pipe. Everything in the workshop had a purpose, a sequence, and a beautiful, predictable order. The rhythmic turning of the gears provided a hypnotic background for his developing mind. He began to see that the world was not a collection of random events, but a grand interconnected machine. He would run his fingers over the smooth, cool surfaces of the steel components, feeling the subtle vibrations of the energy contained within. His uncle Jakob, seeing the boy's silent fascination, would explain the laws of physics as if they were stories of adventure. They talked about how heat moved, how light traveled, and how magnets could pull at each other without ever touching. These conversations were like seeds planted in the fertile soil of Albert's imagination. He didn't just hear the words, he visualized the forces. In his mind's eye, he saw the magnetic fields as invisible, curved lines stretching through the air, like the ribs of a giant umbrella. He saw the heat as a frantic dance of tiny, invisible particles, invisible to the eye but felt by the skin. The late afternoon light would filter through the tall, soot-stained windows of the factory, casting long, geometric shadows across the floor. In those moments of transition from day to evening, the workshop felt most magical. The noise of the city outside, the clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, and the shouts of street vendors felt a world away. Inside, there was only the steady, mechanical breathing of the dynamos. Albert found a profound comfort in this predictability. He was a boy who loved the why behind the what, while other children were satisfied with knowing that a lamp burned. Albert wanted to understand the invisible journey of the electron that made it glow. This relentless curiosity was not a loud or aggressive thing. It was a slow, deep-seated hunger that grew in the silence of his observations. He would watch the way a drop of oil fell into a pool of water, expanding in perfect, iridescent circles, and he would ponder the geometry of the surface. As the workday ended and the machines were slowly powered down, the silence that followed was even more profound. The hum would fade into a whisper, and the whisper into a ghost of a sound, until only the settling of the building remained. Albert would walk home with his father, his small hand tucked into a larger one, feeling the cool evening air on his face. The sky above Munich would begin to fill with stars, the same stars that the compass needle seemed to be communicating with. He realized that the same laws that governed the dynamos in the workshop also governed the movements of the planets and the light of the sun. The universe was a singular, harmonious song, and he was beginning to learn the notes. That night, as he drifted into sleep, the rhythmic thrumming of the factory would still be echoing in his mind, transformed into a celestial lullaby. He dreamed of wires that stretched to the moon and currents that flowed through the stars. A young boy at peace with the infinite complexity of a world that was, at its heart, beautifully simple. As the years of his youth unfolded, the structured environment of Munich gave way to the breathtaking, open vistas of Switzerland. Imagine a young Albert, now a student in Aarau, escaping the rigid walls of the classroom to find his true teacher, the Swiss Alps. This transition was like moving from a small, candlelit room into the boundless brilliance of a summer afternoon. The air here was different. It was thin, cold, and possessed a crystalline purity that seemed to sharpen the mind and settle the spirit. Imagine the sound of his boots treading softly on the mountain paths, the rhythmic crunch of gravel and dry pine needles underfoot. The mountains stood as silent, ancient giants, their jagged peaks capped with eternal snow that glowed with a soft, ethereal light under the high sun. For Albert, this landscape was not just scenery. It was a physical manifestation of the grandeur of the laws of physics. He would spend entire days wandering through the high Alpine meadows, where the only sound was the distant, melodic chime of cowbells and the constant, rushing whisper of the mountain wind. This wind, moving through the valleys and over the ridges, became a tactile reminder of the invisible forces he so dearly loved to contemplate. He would sit by the edge of a mountain lake, the water so still and clear that it acted as a perfect mirror for the sky. He watched how a single pebble, dropped into the water, would create a series of perfect, concentric rings that expanded until they touched the shore. In his mind, he wasn't just seeing ripples. He was seeing the way waves move through the universe, the way light travels, the way sound ripples through the air, and the way energy radiates from a central source. The stillness of the lake was a canvas upon which he could paint his most complex thoughts. In these moments of profound solitude, Albert felt a deep connection to the old. One, his private name for the mystery behind the universe. He would lie on his back in the tall green grass, watching the clouds move with a slow, majestic grace. He began to wonder about the nature of time itself. Does time flow like a river, steady and unchanging? Or is it something more mysterious, something that depends on how we move through it? These were not stressful thoughts. They were a form of meditation. The vastness of the mountains made human worries seem small and insignificant, allowing his mind to expand to the scale of the cosmos. He found a unique kind of peace in the realization that the same gravity that held him to the mountainside also held the moon in its orbit and guided the distant stars in their ancient dances. The evenings in the Swiss villages were a time of deep, indigo shadows and the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Albert would return to his lodgings, his spirit refreshed by the silence of the heights. He would sit by a small lamp, the golden light flickering against the walls, and record his thoughts in a notebook with slow, deliberate strokes of his pen. But even as he worked, part of his mind remained in the mountains, drifting through the cool, thin air. He realized that to understand the universe, one must first learn to be still. The mountains had taught him that the most complex truths often reveal themselves in the quietest moments. As the moon rose over the snowy peaks, casting a pale silver glow over the silent valleys, Albert would close his eyes. He felt as though he were floating in a great, dark ocean of stars anchored only by the steady, rhythmic pulse of his own curiosity. The world was a place of infinite beauty and perfect logic, and in the heart of the Swiss Alps, the young dreamer had found the sanctuary he needed to begin his journey into the very fabric of reality. The transition from the wild, open heights of the Alps to the ancient, winding streets of Zurich was a move into a world of stone, shadow, and the slow, rhythmic flow of the Limit River. Imagine Zurich in the final years of the 19th century, a city of gray cobblestones that glistened after a light rain, and narrow alleyways where the air felt thick with the history of centuries. For Albert, now a student at the Polytechnic, the city was a vast library of sensory experiences. Every morning he would walk to the university, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls in a steady, hypnotic beat. He loved the city most in the early hours, when the mist still clung to the surface of the lake in the world, felt like a charcoal drawing, soft and blurred at the edges. He would often find himself in the small, dimly lit cafes that tucked themselves away in the corners of the old town. Imagine the atmosphere inside, the low, constant hum of quiet conversations, the rhythmic clinking of silver spoons against porcelain cups, and the rich dark aroma of roasted coffee and pipe tobacco. Albert would sit in a corner, a small notebook open before him. But he was often not writing. Instead, he was watching. He would observe the way the steam rose from his cup in delicate, swirling patterns, a miniature storm of white vapor that followed the hidden currents of the air. To anyone else, it was just steam. To Albert, it was a lesson in fluid dynamics, a visual representation of the invisible chaos that governed the physical world. He could spend an hour just watching. A single drop of condensation slide down the side of a glass, fascinated by its slow, gravitational journey and the way it magnified the world behind it. The university library was another sanctuary of silence and profound stillness. Imagine the vast high-ceilinged room, where the only sound was the occasional, soft rustle of a turning page, a sound like the wings of a moth. The air was cool and smelled of old leather, drying ink, and the dust of 1,000 years of human thought. Albert would sit at a long oak table, the wood smoothed by the hands of countless students before him. He would immerse himself in the works of the great masters, Maxwell, Hertz, and Helmholtz. As he read, the world around him would seem to dissolve. The walls of the library would fall away, and he would find himself in a universe made of pure light and mathematical equations. He felt the rhythmic pull of the logic, a steady pulse that lay beneath the surface of the complex theories. It was as if he were listening to a grand, silent orchestra, and for the first time, he was beginning to understand the score. His room in Zurich was small and simple, a place of monastic quiet. In the evenings, the light of a single kerosene lamp would cast a warm, flickering glow over his desk, creating long, dancing shadows that played across the ceiling. Outside his window, the city would slowly settle into its nightly rest. The chime of the church bells would ring out across the rooftops, a deep, bronze vibration that felt like the heartbeat of time itself. Albert would sit by the window, watching the moonlight reflect off the ripples of the lake. He began to think about the nature of the ether, the invisible substance that scientists believed filled all of space. He imagined it as a vast, silent ocean, and he wondered if light was merely a wave moving through this stillness. These thoughts were not a burden. They were a comfort. They provided a sense of connection to something much larger than himself, a universal harmony that transcended the small, daily struggles of a student's life. As the night grew deeper and the silence in the room became absolute, Albert would put down his pen and listen to the stillness. It was a thick, textured silence, a silence that felt heavy with the weight of the stars. He realized that the city of Zurich, with its stone bridges and its busy markets, was just a small island in a vast, mysterious cosmos. The rhythmic flow of the river outside was a reminder that everything was in motion. Even when it appeared to be at rest, he would drift into a deep, restorative sleep, his mind still wandering through the narrow streets of his imagination, where the laws of physics were as clear and beautiful as a mountain stream. The world was a masterpiece of order and light, and in the quiet heart of the city, the young scientist was slowly, patiently, learning to read the mind of the universe. Every moment was a meditation, every shadow a teacher, and every breath a step closer to the secrets of the stars. In the year 1902, Albert Einstein moved to the city of Bern, Switzerland, to begin a chapter of his life that appeared, on the surface, to be one of absolute, mundane routine. Yet it was within the quiet, gray walls of the Federal Office for Intellectual Property that the most explosive ideas in human history were born. Imagine the atmosphere of that office, a place defined by the slow, rhythmic passage of time. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying the scent of old parchment, black ink, and the faint, dry smell of coal dust from the heaters. It was a world of paper, vast, stacks of technical drawings and descriptions that arrived daily from every corner of the world. Albert's job was to examine these patents, to look at the inventions of others and find the hidden logic, or the fatal flaw, within their designs. To a casual observer, he was just a clerk in a dark suit, sitting at a wooden desk, but in reality, he was a traveler in the deepest realms of thought. Imagine the soundscape of that room. It was a symphony of small, quiet noises. There was the constant, rhythmic scratching of steel-nibbed pens against thick paper, a sound like the scurrying of tiny insects. There was the occasional, soft thud of a rubber stamp hitting a document, and the dry, papery rustle of blueprints being unfolded across the wide oak tables. But above all, there was the clock. A large wooden clock hung on the wall, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a relentless, hypnotic tick-tock. For 8 hours a day, Albert lived within the heartbeat of that clock. He began to observe the way the second hand moved, a tiny, mechanical jump every 60 seconds. He wondered, if he were to move away from that clock at the speed of light, would the ticking slow down? Would the pendulum appear to freeze in midair? This office, a temple of bureaucracy, became his private laboratory of the mind. His desk was a small island of order in a sea of paper. He had a specific way of arranging his tools, his pens, his inkwell, and his magnifying glass. He loved the tactile sensation of the documents, the way the heavy paper felt beneath his fingertips, slightly rough and cool. He would lean over a technical drawing of a new, synchronized clock system for a train station, and his mind would immediately leave the room. He wasn't just looking at gears and levers. He was imagining the invisible signals of light traveling between stations. He would visualize the pulses of energy moving through the wires, and he would ask himself, what does it mean for two events to happen at the same time? The silence of the office allowed his thoughts to expand, to stretch across the continent, following the imaginary train tracks into the distant horizon. Every patent he examined was a gateway into a deeper mystery. The light in the Bern office changed slowly throughout the day. In the morning it was a pale, gray light that made the dust motes dance in the air like tiny suspended stars. By mid-afternoon, the sun would dip lower, casting long, golden rectangles across the floorboards, highlighting the grain of the wood and the worn spots where generations of clerks had walked. Albert would often pause, resting his chin on his hand, and stare at these patches of light. He watched how they moved, almost imperceptibly, as the earth rotated. He felt the immense silent weight of the planet beneath him, spinning through the void. The office was no longer a cage. It was a vantage point. He realized that the most Profound truths did not require a giant telescope or a complex laboratory. They required only a quiet room and the patience to listen to the silence. When his shift ended, he would walk out into the streets of Bern, his mind still vibrating with the day's contemplations. The city was a place of high, arched arcades and ancient stone fountains where the water flowed in a constant, soothing gurgle. He would walk slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets, feeling the cool evening breeze against his skin. The rhythmic clack-clack of his shoes on the cobblestones felt like a continuation of the office clock, a steady measurement of his passage through the world. He would stop by the great Zeitglocke clock tower, watching the mechanical figures perform their ancient dance as the hour struck. The deep resonant chime of the bell would vibrate through the air, a sound that felt like it was rippling through the very fabric of space and time. Returning to his small apartment on Kramgasse, the silence would greet him once again. He would sit in the twilight, without turning on the lamps, allowing his eyes to adjust to the deepening blue of the room. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for his mundane job. The patent office had given him the greatest gift a thinker could ask for, a quiet life that allowed his inner world to catch fire. As he drifted toward sleep, the images of synchronized clocks, moving trains, and beams of light would weave together into a beautiful mathematical tapestry. He was a clerk by day, but in the stillness of the night, he was the architect of a new universe. The world was sleeping, the city was still, and in the heart of Bern, a silent revolution was beginning. One heartbeat and one tick of the clock at a time. The year 1905 was beginning to unfold, a year that would later be known as the Annus Mirabilis, or the Miracle Year. But for Albert, sitting in the quiet seclusion of his apartment after a long day at the patent office, it began with a single, profound thought experiment that would stretch his mind to the very edges of reality. Imagine the room. The fireplace has burned down to a soft, pulsing orange glow, and the only light comes from a solitary candle, its flame standing perfectly still in the draftless air. The scent of wood smoke and old paper lingers, creating a cocoon of absolute sensory peace. Albert leans back in his chair, closes his eyes, and begins a journey that no human had ever dared to take. He stops thinking in words and starts thinking in pure, luminous images. He imagines himself standing on the edge of the sun, and in a burst of brilliant, silent energy, he hitches a ride on a beam of light as it begins its 8-minute journey toward the earth. This was the ultimate Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment. Imagine the sensation of this journey. To the rest of the world, light moves at a staggering speed, a cosmic limit that nothing can surpass. But in Albert's mind, he is traveling alongside it. He imagines himself looking at the wave of light as if it were a solid, frozen ripple in a great cosmic ocean. The silence of space in his mind is total, a deep, velvety blackness that feels both heavy and weightless at the same time. He wonders, if he were to hold a mirror in front of his face while riding this beam, would he see his own reflection? According to the physics of the time, the light from his face would never reach the mirror because they were moving at the same speed. But Albert's intuition, honed by years of listening to the quiet logic of the universe, told him that the laws of nature must be the same for everyone, everywhere. The contemplation of this paradox became a slow, rhythmic meditation. He would spend hours in this state of mental suspension, his body perfectly still in the chair while his spirit raced across the solar system. He visualized the light not as a frantic, fast thing, but as a steady, vibrating pulse, a constant in a world of variables. He began to see that if light was the constant, then everything else, time, space, even mass, must be flexible. This was a radical, earth-shaking idea, but in the silence of his room, it felt as natural as the breath leaving his lungs. He imagined time stretching out like a piece of golden elastic, slowing down as he moved faster, until a single second felt like a lifetime of quiet observation. Space itself seemed to contract, the vast distances between planets becoming manageable, as if the universe were folding itself to accommodate his journey. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of this vision. Outside, the city of Bern was asleep, but inside Albert's mind, a new sun was rising. He watched the way the imaginary light bent around the curves of the planets, a silent, graceful dance governed by invisible rules. This wasn't a struggle of the intellect. It was an act of surrender to the beauty of the cosmos. He felt a deep humming peace in realizing that the universe was far more mysterious and flexible than anyone had imagined. The rigidity of the old world was melting away, replaced by a fluid, shimmering reality where everything was connected by the light. He felt like a sailor on a vast, dark sea, guided by a lighthouse that never flickered and never moved. As the night wore on, the candle in his room burned low, the wax dripping slowly and silently down the side of the brass holder. Albert opened his eyes, and for a moment, the world of stone and wood felt strange and heavy. He looked at his hands, his desk, and the ticking clock on the wall, and he realized that they were all made of the same energy. He had been chasing through the stars. The boundaries between the self and the universe were beginning to blur. He felt a profound sense of tranquility, a cosmic religious feeling, as he would later call it. He knew that he was onto something that would change how humanity viewed its place in the heavens. But for now, it was a secret shared only between him and the silence of the night. As he finally laid his head on his pillow, the rhythmic pulse of the light continued to vibrate in his mind, a steady, golden hum that carried him into a deep, dreamless sleep. The universe was vast, the light was constant, and the dreamer was at peace. By the year 1915, the quiet clerk from the patent office had become a professor in Berlin. Yet Albert Einstein's truest home remained the silent, internal landscape of his own mind. This was the period when he moved beyond the speed of light and began to contemplate the very structure of the universe itself, what we now call the general theory of relativity. Imagine Albert sitting in his study during a cold Berlin winter. Outside, the world is hushed by a blanket of thick, white snow that muffles the sound of the city, creating an atmosphere of profound icy stillness. Inside, the room is warm, smelling of cedarwood, old leather-bound books, and the sweet, lingering scent of his tobacco pipe. The only light comes from a green-shaded desk lamp, casting a soft emerald glow over his papers. In this sanctuary, Albert began to visualize the universe not as an empty void, but as a physical fabric, a vast, invisible trampoline made of space and time woven together. He imagined this fabric as a cosmic silk, stretched tight from one end of the universe to the other. In his mind, he placed a heavy sun in the center of this silk, and he watched with slow, deliberate focus as the fabric began to sag and curve under the weight. This was his revolutionary insight. Gravity was not a mysterious tug-of-war, but a geometric curve in the very floor of the universe. Imagine the patience required to visualize this. He would spend hours watching an imaginary planet, like a small marble rolling along the curved slopes of space, held in its orbit not by strings, but by the natural shape of the world itself. The silence in his study was so deep that he could almost hear the cosmic fabric stretching. He felt the rhythmic pulse of the planets as they moved through these invisible valleys, a slow and majestic dance that had been performing for billions of years without a sound. This realization brought with it a sense of overwhelming peace. If space and time could bend, then the universe was a living, breathing entity, flexible and harmonious. He began to think about light once more, the constant traveler. He imagined a beam of light passing near a massive star and felt the thrill of seeing that light bend, following the curve of space like a stream of water following the contour of a hill. This was no longer just physics. It was a form of architectural poetry. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, his breathing slow and rhythmic, matching the immense, slow cycles of the celestial bodies he was studying. He felt a profound connection to the stars outside his window, realizing that the same laws that governed the flickering light in the distant sky were the same laws that determined the weight of his pen and the beating of his heart. As the night deepened, the silence of the room seemed to expand, reaching out to touch the edges of the galaxy. Albert felt small yet infinitely connected. He understood that time was not a rigid, ticking clock, but a river that could speed up or slow down depending on the gravity of the objects within it. This meant that every moment was unique, a precious and flexible gift of the cosmos. He would lean back in his chair, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling and feel the immense, silent rotation of the earth as it carried him through the velvet dark. The world was a place of hidden depths and breathtaking geometry. As he finally blew out the lamp, the darkness of the room felt warm and protective, a reflection of the vast curved universe he had just mapped in his mind. He slept with the knowledge that the stars were not just points of light, but beacons in a grand, beautiful, and perfectly ordered design. The final decades of Albert Einstein's life were spent in the quiet, tree-lined sanctuary of Princeton, New Jersey. Imagine a world where time seems to have slowed to a graceful rhythmic crawl. The air in Princeton is different. It carries the scent of damp ivy, old stone, and the crisp, clean breath of the nearby woods. Albert lived in a simple white house on Mercer Street, a place that felt more like a hermitage than the home of a world-famous genius. Every morning, he would walk to the Institute for Advanced Study, his silver hair flowing like a halo in the wind, his footsteps soft and deliberate on the sidewalk. This walk was his daily meditation. He would pause to look at a wildflower, or to watch the way a puddle reflected the shifting clouds, finding as much mystery in a drop of rain as he did in a collapsing star. The world was a constant conversation between the observer and the observed, and Albert was a master of listening. Inside his home, the atmosphere was one of profound intellectual stillness. Imagine his study, a room bathed in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon. The walls were lined with books whose spines were worn and softened by years of use. There was a large, comfortable chair where he would sit for hours, a wooden pipe resting in his hand, the thin trail of smoke rising in a slow, hypnotic spiral toward the ceiling. But the most important object in the house was not a telescope or a chalkboard. It was his violin, which he affectionately called Lena. In the evenings, when the weight of the day's equations felt heavy, he would take out the violin. Imagine the sound, the first, long draw of the bow across the strings, a warm, resonant note that filled the quiet house. He played Mozart and Bach, music that mirrored the mathematical perfection of the universe. To Albert, music and physics were two sides of the same coin, rhythmic, logical, and beautiful. As he played, the vibration of the wood against his shoulder felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that the entire cosmos was a symphony of vibrating energy. In his final years, Albert's thoughts turned more and more toward the unified field. Theory, a grand, silent dream of finding a single equation that could explain everything, from the movement of atoms to the expansion of galaxies. He would sit by the window, watching the seasons change in the garden. He saw the snow fall in the winter, each flake a unique geometric masterpiece, and he saw the blossoms of spring, a testament to the persistent, quiet power of life. He realized that he had spent his life trying to read the thoughts of the old one, and though the final answer remained elusive, he felt a deep sense of peace in the pursuit. He wasn't looking for fame or power. He was looking for the underlying harmony that made the world a home rather than a chaos. He would often say that the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious, the knowledge that there is something we cannot grasp, but which nevertheless exists in its highest wisdom and most radiant beauty. As the shadows of his own life began to lengthen, he moved into a state of ultimate tranquility. He was no longer the young clerk in Bern or the revolutionary professor in Berlin. He had become a citizen of the cosmos. Imagine his final days, where the boundaries between his mind and the universe began to dissolve entirely. He would lie in bed, listening to the rhythmic ticking of a clock, but he no longer saw it as a measurement of time. Instead, he saw it as a pulse of light, a ripple in the fabric of space. He felt the weight of his body on the mattress, and he knew it was just the earth's gentle way of holding on to him a little longer. He was ready to let go, not with fear, but with the curiosity of a child. He felt like a traveler who had spent a long day exploring a magnificent city and was now looking forward to the quiet of the night. On his final night, the world outside was still. The stars over Princeton were bright and clear, the same stars that had guided his compass when he was 5 years old. Albert breathed slowly, each breath a soft, rhythmic wave. He felt the immense, silent pull of the galaxy, inviting him back into the great dance of energy and light. He understood that death was not an end, but a transformation, a return to the fundamental atoms and the timeless energy of the stars. In the absolute silence of the room, he felt a final, perfect harmony. He was no longer a man. He was a thought in the mind of the universe. The clocks continued to tick. The planets continued to curve, and the light continued its eternal journey through the dark. Albert Einstein was at rest, drifting back into the infinite, glowing mystery that he had loved so dearly. The dreamer was gone, but the dream remained, a silent, golden pulse in the heart of the cosmos. Sleep now, for the stars are watching, and the universe is at peace.